The wedding invitation arrived on a Thursday, which was, by any measure, the wrong day for the Earl of Keswick to discover that the woman he had destroyed was doing considerably better without him. He found it on his breakfast table, between a parliamentary brief and a letter from his solicitor, cream-coloured, sealed in dark blue wax, the kind of card that announced itself before it was opened. His name was written on the front in a hand he recognized before he had fully registered that he recognized it, the way the body knows certain things before the mind has consented to know them. He set down his coffee. He picked up the card. He read it once, and then he read it again. And then he sat for a long moment in the particular silence of a man who has just been handed evidence that the world has continued, in his absence, to arrange itself without his permission. Lady Cecily Montrose requests the honour of your presence at her marriage to Robert Ellery, Viscount Dunmore, on the 17th of March at St. James's, Piccadilly, at 11 o'clock in the morning. She had invited him. That was the first thing. She had written his name in her own hand on a wedding invitation to her marriage to another man, and she had sent it. And somewhere in London on this Thursday morning, she was going about her business knowing that he had received it, and he could not decide, sitting there in the grey February light with the card between his fingers, whether this was the cruelest thing anyone had ever done to him, or whether he had arranged, entirely by himself, for it to feel that way. He had not thought about Cecily Montrose in 8 months. This was not true. He had thought about her precisely as often as a man thinks about the thing he has decided not to think about, which is to say, constantly, and in the particular sideways manner of a man who has convinced himself that peripheral attention does not count. 8 months ago, in June, he had ended their engagement at a dinner party. Not privately, not in a letter, not in a quiet and respectful conversation in her father's study. At a dinner party, at Lady Fentworth's table, in front of 11 people who had excellent memories and poor discretion, with Vivian Harcourt sitting 3 chairs down in a red dress that had cost more than most men earned in a year. He had not made a speech. He had not needed to. He had simply arrived with Vivienne and stayed with Vivienne and left with Vivienne, and the message had been received with the clarity of something written in large letters on a very clean wall. London had understood. London always understood. What London had not done, and what had surprised him in the months that followed, was punish Cecily Montrose for being publicly discarded. He had expected, in the way that powerful men expect things that are not reasonable but have simply never been contradicted, that the social difficulty of the situation would fall primarily on her, that she would retreat, that she would perhaps remove herself to the country for a season and return in reduced circumstances, quieter, diminished in the small ways that society specialized in diminishing women who had been made inconvenient. She had not retreated. She had appeared at the autumn events with the composure of a woman who either had not noticed she had been humiliated or had noticed and found it insufficient to alter her plans. She had danced. She had conversed. She had been seen laughing, genuinely laughing, at something Lord Bracewell said at the Harrington Ball, 8 weeks after the dinner party, and the report of it had reached him in his club and sat in his chest in a way he had not examined closely, because examining it would have required a category of honesty he was not yet prepared for. And now she was marrying Viscount Dunmore, who was steady and well-regarded and entirely without the kind of dangerous edges that made a man interesting at 23 and catastrophic at 35. Dunmore, who had not, as far as anyone knew, ever walked into a room with the wrong woman and destroyed something valuable simply because the destruction was available to him. The Earl of Keswick set the invitation down on the table beside his untouched coffee and looked at it for a moment longer than was useful. Then he reached for his pen. He told himself he was writing to decline. He told himself this with the confidence of a man who has not yet understood that the reason he reached for the pen at all was not to write a refusal. It was because Cecily Montrose had sent him this card, knowing he would reach for the pen, and she had always, every single time, known exactly what he would do before he did it. The question he could not answer, sitting there in the grey February light, was whether she had sent the invitation to close a door, or to see if he would finally, 8 months too late, understand which side of it he was supposed to be standing on. He wrote to accept. He told himself, sealing the envelope, that this was the civilized response. That declining would imply he was affected. That attending would demonstrate the kind of equanimity that men of his position were supposed to possess in the face of personal inconvenience, and that a wedding was not, in the final accounting, a personal inconvenience unless you had made it one yourself. He told himself all of this in the efficient interior voice he used for parliamentary reasoning and financial decisions, and he posted the letter before the reasoning had time to develop any visible cracks. The cracks appeared at his club that same evening. Marchmont found him at the window table, with a glass of port he hadn't touched, and the expression of a man engaged in a very private argument with himself that he was not winning. Marchmont was the only man in London who had known the Earl of Keswick long enough to find his silences legible. He sat down without being invited, ordered his own port, and waited with the patience of a man who understood that the first person to speak in this particular variety of silence always lost something. The Earl spoke first. "Did you know about Dunmore?" "Everyone knew about Dunmore," Marchmont said pleasantly. "He has been calling on her since November. It was in the society pages in December. There was a small notice in the Gazette in January. I don't read the society pages. You don't read anything that might require you to feel something," Marchmont said, still pleasantly, in the way of a man who has earned the right to say accurate things to his friends without softening them. "It is one of your more consistent qualities." The Earl looked at his port. "I've accepted the invitation." Marchmont's expression did not change, which meant it changed entirely in the small, invisible way that long acquaintance makes readable. "Have you?" It would have been rude to decline. "It would have been sane to decline," Marchmont said. Rude would have been acceptable. Sane was what was called for. He picked up his own glass. "Why did she invite you?" "I don't know." "Yes, you do." The Earl said nothing. Outside the club window, London moved through its evening business. Carriages and lamplight, and the ordinary machinery of a city that did not pause for the private reckonings of earls. He thought about Cecily Montrose laughing at the Harrington ball 8 weeks after the dinner party. He had not been at that ball. He had heard about the laughing from 3 separate sources in the space of a single week, which meant it had been the kind of laughing that people felt compelled to report, which meant it had been genuine, which was the detail that had lodged in him like a splinter he had never managed to locate precisely enough to remove. "She was never angry," he said finally. "That was the thing. I expected anger. I had arranged, at Lady Fentworth's table, one of the more public humiliations available in the London social calendar, and she was never, as far as I could determine, angry." "No," Marchmont said. "She wasn't." Something in his tone made the Earl look at him directly. "You've spoken to her." "I've known the Montrose family for 15 years. Her brother Thomas is one of my oldest friends." Marchmont set down his glass. "I spoke to her in October, at the Whitmore dinner. We spoke about you, briefly, because she raised it, and then we spoke about other things, because she decided she had said enough." "What did she say?" Marchmont looked at him for a moment, with the expression of a man measuring the distance between what a friend wants to hear and what he needs to. "She said she hoped you were well. She said she bore you no ill will, and she said that she had spent a great deal of time, in the months since Lady Fentworth's dinner, being grateful." Grateful. That was the word she used. The Earl picked up his port. He put it down again. Grateful for what? She didn't say, and I didn't ask, because the way she said it made it clear that the answer was something she had decided to keep for herself, and that keeping it was part of how she had managed to be so composed about the whole business. He looked at his friend steadily. "She is not performing composure, Julian. Whatever you imagined when you heard about the Harrington ball, it was not a performance. She had genuinely arrived somewhere, which is either very good news or very bad news, depending on which side of the door you find yourself on." The Earl thought about that all the way home and most of the night. He discovered, in the weeks between receiving the invitation and the 17th of March, that a man who has decided to attend a wedding can find an extraordinary number of reasons in any given day to reconsider the decision and an equal number to hold to it, and that the balance between these 2 sets of reasons tells him something specific about himself that he would rather not know. He saw her once before the wedding. He had not arranged it. He did not believe she had arranged it either, which made it the most honest encounter they had had in the entire history of their acquaintance, which was a history composed largely of arrangements. It was at the Turner Gallery on a Wednesday afternoon in late February, the kind of overcast afternoon that emptied fashionable venues of fashionable people and left only the ones who had actually come to look at the paintings. She was standing in front of a landscape, not performing looking at it, actually looking at it, with the slightly tilted attention of a person engaged in a private conversation with a piece of work that had said something interesting. And her hair was simpler than he remembered it at parties, less arranged, and she looked, standing there in the grey gallery light, like a version of herself that the season had not yet gotten its hands on. He should have turned around, he knew this. He continued walking toward her anyway, because he had established in weeks of sleepless reasoning that he was not capable, where Cecily Montrose was concerned, of doing the thing he should do when the thing he actually did was still available to him. She heard his footstep and turned, and her expression when she saw him was not the expression he had been rehearsing responses to for weeks. It was not cold, it was not warm. It was the expression of a woman who had prepared herself for this possibility and found, on arrival, that she was more prepared than she had expected to be, and that this fact told her something about how far she had come. "Lord Keswick," she said. "Lady Cecily." He stopped at a correct distance. Not a warm distance, a correct one. "I received your invitation. I know. You accepted." She turned back to the painting briefly, and then back to him. "I wasn't certain you would. Were you certain I would come, if I accepted?" She considered this with the seriousness he had always, even at his worst, found himself unable to dismiss. "I thought it was approximately even," she said. "You might accept and come. You might accept and find a reason not to. You might decline and feel correctly that declining was the honest answer. And you sent it anyway?" "Yes." "Why?" She looked at him for a moment with those steady grey eyes that had always seen more of him than he had intended to show. "Because I wanted to," she said simply. "Because I had decided in September that I was finished making decisions based on what would appear correct, or what would protect me from one thing or another. Robert asked me to marry him, and I said yes, because I wanted to, and I sent you an invitation because I wanted to, and I find that wanting to is a sufficient reason for most things." He did not know what to do with this. He had prepared for anger, even for a cold and refined version of it. He had prepared for the particular brightness that can live in the eyes of someone who has successfully moved on and wants you to notice. He had not prepared for a woman who was simply telling him the truth about her own interior, without requiring anything from him in return. "You're not angry," he said. "No, you should be." "Probably," she said, "but anger requires a sustained interest in the person you're angry with. And I found that my interest in being wounded by you ran out sometime in August." She said this without cruelty. Factually, as one states a condition of geography. I was angry in July. I was very angry in August. By September, I was mostly tired. And tired has a way of becoming something else if you let it. By October, it had become something else entirely. "Grateful," he said. Something in her expression shifted. "Small. Marchmont told you." "He told me the word, not the reason." She looked at the painting again. A grey field under a wide sky. The kind of painting that didn't announce itself and got more interesting the longer you stood with it. "I was engaged to you for 8 months," she said. "And in those 8 months, I was so occupied with being what an engagement to the Earl of Keswick required me to be, that I had almost entirely stopped being anything else. Careful in company. Correct at all times. I stopped arguing at dinner because you preferred evenings without friction. I stopped talking about the things I actually found interesting because they were not the things an earl's intended discussed at his table." She did not say this with recrimination. She was reporting a thing she had observed about herself, with the detachment of a scientist examining a prior error. By the time May came, I had become so quiet and so correct and so pleasant that I barely recognized myself when I passed a mirror. He heard this. He wanted to say he hadn't known. He stopped himself, because the truth was that he had known, in the way you know things you find convenient, which is to say, he had noticed her quietness, and categorized it as compatibility rather than as the sound a person makes when they are slowly disappearing. "And then you chose to bring Vivienne Harcourt to Lady Fentworth's table," Cecily said, "in front of 11 people. And I went home and I sat in my room, and I waited to collapse, and I didn't collapse. I sat there, and what I felt, underneath the humiliation of it, the genuine humiliation which I will not pretend away, was the specific and almost physical sensation of a constraint being removed." She turned to look at him then, which is why I said grateful, because you did an inexcusable thing in the worst possible way and somehow managed to give me back something I had been slowly handing away. He stood with this. He had come to the gallery without a speech, and he was leaving it without one, which was correct, but the correctness of it was not comfortable. He had not understood, in 8 months of thinking about Cecily Montrose in the sideways fashion of a man who has decided not to think about something, that the thing she had been freed from was partly, substantially, specifically him. Not the engagement, him, the version of himself he had required her to diminish herself to accommodate. "Viscount Dunmore," he said, and stopped. "Robert argues with me at dinner," she said, and there was something in her voice that was quiet and full and entirely her own. "About everything. Politics, art, whether the east wing of his country house should be opened in winter. He is wrong about the east wing, and I intend to be very clear about this throughout our marriage, and he will enjoy it." She looked at the painting one more time. "He is not more impressive than you, Julian. I don't want you to think that is the point. He is not wealthier or better connected or more interesting at a distance. He is simply a man who does not require me to be less so, that he can feel like more." She used his given name, not Lord Keswick, not with warmth exactly, but with the particular honesty of a woman who had decided that plain speaking was the only language left between them worth using. He had not heard his name in her voice in 8 months, and it landed differently than he expected. Not like an opening, like a door being gently and completely closed. She left the gallery 20 minutes later. He stayed in front of the landscape for another half-hour. The grey field, the wide sky, the painting that didn't announce itself. He began to understand why she had been standing in front of it. Now he needed to address one more thing, because it had been sitting in the story like a loose thread since June. Vivienne Harcourt, the woman for whom he had walked into Lady Fentworth's dinner and burned everything to the ground. It had lasted 6 weeks. That was the full sum of it. 6 weeks of the kind of intensity that mistakes velocity for depth. And then one morning in August, he had sat across from Vivienne at breakfast in her drawing room and understood, with the cold precision he usually reserved for parliamentary briefs, that the person she found most interesting in any room was herself, and that she had found him useful precisely as long as the Earl of Keswick's company enhanced that interest, and that the enhancement had run its course. She had not been cruel about it. She had been efficient, which was, in some ways, harder to absorb. He had destroyed a good woman's peace for 6 weeks of efficiency. He had sat with that in August, and found it would not sit quietly, and had carried it since, with the specific discomfort of a man who cannot put something down and has not yet understood that the only remedy is to stop trying to find a comfortable way to hold it. He attended the wedding on the 17th of March. Of course he attended. He sat in the 6th row on the left side of St. James's, Piccadilly, in a church full of spring light and the particular hush of 250 people who had heard the story and come to see the resolution. And he watched Cecily Montrose walk down the aisle in a dress the colour of winter cream toward Robert Ellery, Viscount Dunmore, who was watching her with the uncomplicated open expression of a man who had not required editing. She walked steadily, not like a woman performing steadiness, with the natural unhurried gait of a woman going toward something she had chosen clearly and found good. Her face when she reached the altar was not the composed, neutral face he had memorized at parties and across dinner tables. It was present, specific, the face of a woman who was actually here, in this moment, without the portion of herself she had formerly kept in reserve as protection. He had done that, he understood, sitting in the 6th row. He had done that to her, the reserve, the performance, the quiet, disappearing act. He had required it without demanding it, which was almost worse, because it meant she had done it willingly, out of the particular willingness of a person who mistakes diminishment for accommodation. The ceremony was 20 minutes. The vows were said in voices that did not waver. When Dunmore placed the ring, Cecily looked at him with an expression that the Earl of Keswick could not name from the 6th row, except to say that it was nothing he had ever put there. He stayed for the beginning of the wedding breakfast and left before the toasts. Not from pain, exactly, though pain was present, a specific and deserved variety of it. He left because he had understood, somewhere between the gallery in February and the church in March, that the appropriate response to this particular education was not to display it publicly, but to carry it home and sit with it in the honest dark and let it do what it needed to do. Marchmont found him on the steps outside, hat in hand, watching the March street. "You stayed through the ceremony," Marchmont said. "I accepted the invitation. Most men would have found a reason not to come at all. I arranged the situation," the Earl said. It seemed correct to see it through. Marchmont stood beside him for a moment in the cold. And she is happy," he said, genuinely, "the kind that doesn't perform." He turned his hat in his hands. "I had not understood, previously, that there was a version of her that looked like that. I had not understood because I had been so occupied with the version she was for me that I had not inquired about the others." Marchmont said nothing. He had the wisdom, occasionally, to recognize when a friend was saying something that needed to be said aloud rather than agreed with. "I think I would like to be the sort of man," the Earl said, carefully, in the voice he used for things he had not yet committed to language, "who notices that kind of thing in advance, rather than subsequently." "That would require asking questions," Marchmont said, "about other people, with genuine interest in the answer. I am aware, and attending to what you're told. I am also aware of that, and not choosing a woman who finds you decorative over one who finds you worth arguing with." Cecily Montrose, the Earl said quietly, was not difficult. She was interesting. I misclassified it. He put his hat on. "There is a difference, and I spent 8 months failing to find it relevant." They stood on the steps for another moment in the March cold. London went about its afternoon with the complete indifference of a city that has hosted 10,000 private reckonings and expects 10,000 more. Then a footman appeared at the door behind them and addressed the Earl by name and held out a small envelope, cream-colored, no seal. The Earl's name written on the front in a hand he recognized. "Lady Dunmore asked that this be given to you as you left," the footman said, and returned inside. Marchmont, with the discretion of a man who had been a good friend for 20 years, found a reason to be interested in something across the street. The Earl held the envelope. It was light. He turned it once and did not open it on the steps. He did not open it in the carriage. He went home to Keswick House, dismissed his valet, sat in the room he kept for the things he actually valued, and opened it there. It was 1 page, both sides. Her handwriting was not the careful invitation hand or the measured gallery voice. It was the handwriting of a woman who had written at speed, because the speed was the only way to stay ahead of something that needed to be said. She had dated it July, 1 month after Lady Fentworth's dinner. She had written about that evening, not with the measured detachment she had used in the gallery, but from inside it. From inside the specific experience of sitting across a room and understanding what was happening before it had technically finished happening. She had written about the 8 months, not as retrospect but from within them, from inside the daily experience of editing yourself smaller and smaller, in the presence of someone who notices the editing and calls it harmony. Near the bottom of the first page, she had written, "You are not a cruel man. I want to say this clearly, because cruelty would be easier. A cruel man could be dismissed entirely. You are instead a man who has never been sufficiently inconvenienced by his own choices to understand what they cost other people. And this is a much more difficult thing to reckon with, because it admits of improvement, and the possibility of improvement in someone who has hurt you requires you to consider that the hurt was not malicious, and that it was not malicious does not make it less real, but it does make it harder to put down cleanly." At the bottom of the second page, in a hand that had slowed, as though the rest had come quickly, and this part required more care, she had written, I hope you find someone who makes you want to ask questions. I hope you find someone whose answers rearrange you. I hope when you do, you don't mistake her interest in you for a willingness to disappear. I wrote this in July because I needed to say it. I am sending it in March because I find that genuine happiness is clarifying about what you owe people. You are owed the truth of what this was. I hope it is useful to you. I believe, which may surprise you, that you are capable of being the kind of man it describes. See, he read it twice. He folded it once. He sat with it in the room where he kept the things he valued, and he let it do what she had intended, which is not comfortable, not clean, not the kind of improvement that can be accomplished in an evening, but real. He was 35 years old. He had a title and a considerable estate, and a reputation in the Lords for a quality of thinking that did not match, he now understood, the quality of his attention in any room where the stakes were personal rather than political. He had been educated in argument and utterly untrained in the specific discipline of paying attention to another person without the intention of prevailing. That was the thing she had named in July, and he was reading in March, and the distance between those two dates was the exact shape of everything he had spent incorrectly. He did not write to Cecily. She was married, and she had given him everything she intended to give, and the correct response was to receive it, without requiring more. He wrote instead to Marchmont, very briefly, to say that he was well, and that the letter had been read, and that he intended, beginning tomorrow, to be measurably less catastrophic than he had managed to be at 35. Marchmont wrote back the next morning, "This is the most promising correspondence I have received from you in a decade. I will expect evidence by summer." The evidence was slow. Good evidence usually is. He began to ask questions at dinner, not rhetorically, not as the opening move of an argument he intended to win, but genuine questions, with the genuine interest in the answer that Marchmont had identified as required. He found that genuine questions produced a quality of conversation he had not known was available to him at his own table. He found that paying attention to people without the intention of prevailing was exhausting at first, and then interesting, and then, gradually, the thing he preferred. He did not see Cecily again that season. He heard through Marchmont that she was well, that she and Dunmore had resolved the East Wing question in what Marchmont described as an outcome satisfying to both parties, a phrase that told him everything. He received this information and felt something that was not quite grief and not quite gladness, but lived in the honest territory between them, which was, he was beginning to understand, the territory where most real things lived. The following autumn, at a small dinner at the Whitmore house, he was seated beside a woman named Frances Colebrook, who spent 40 minutes disputing his position on the new land enclosure proposals in the Lords, and was entirely right about 2 of her 3 objections, and said so immediately, when he demonstrated the flaw in the 3rd, not defensively, but with the immediate appetite of a person who finds being wrong as useful as being right. He asked her a question, a genuine one, with no predetermined destination for the answer. She answered it, and the answer rearranged him, slightly, in the way Cecily's letter had said it would. He thought about that letter on the carriage home. He thought about a woman who had written it in the anger of July, and kept it through everything that followed, through the autumn, and the new attachment, and the engagement, and the wedding preparations, and all the daily business of building a new life, and had sent it finally, on the day she was married, not to wound him, and not to be free of it, but because she had decided, in the clarity of her own arrived happiness, that it might be useful to a man she had once believed in. It had been useful to him. That was the full truth of it. The most useful thing anyone had given him had been written by a woman he had failed, while she still had reason to hope he would not, and delivered on the day she closed that chapter, not as an ending but as a gift she had decided, in the generosity of her happiness, that he had finally become capable of receiving. He did not deserve it. He knew that without flinching from it now. He intended to spend a considerable portion of his remaining years becoming the kind of man who, had he existed at 34, would not have required it. Cecily Montrose, now the Viscountess Dunmore, was seen by him once more, the following spring, at the Harrington garden party, across a lawn that was wide enough to make approach unnecessary. She was laughing at something her husband said, with the genuine, unguarded laughter of a woman who had not edited herself in a year. The Earl of Keswick watched it from across the lawn, and he did not approach, and he did not look away. He simply stood with the full, undiminished fact of it, and found that he could do so without flinching, which was not a small thing, and he knew it, and he was grateful for knowing it, which was perhaps the only form of gratitude still available to him in this particular matter. She did not see him, or if she did, she found, in the wholeness of where she had arrived, that seeing him was simply no longer the kind of event it once had been. Either way, she went on laughing. The spring went on being spring, and the Earl of Keswick stood at the edge of a garden he had not been destroyed by, holding a glass he had not emptied, thinking about a woman who had given him the truth about himself as a wedding gift, and understood, finally and without reservation, that he had been handed something far more valuable than the marriage he had thrown away. He had been handed the chance to become someone worth knowing. He intended, this time, not to waste it. If this story stayed with you, the invitation on the breakfast table, the landscape in the gallery, the letter written in July and delivered in March by a woman who had found something better to carry, tell us in the comments where in the world you are listening from. Stories like this one travel further when you carry them. Subscribe, and we will meet you again in another room, another reckoning, another truth that was always waiting to be given to the right person at exactly the right time.